everyone. I'm so glad to be back for Season 3 of the Best Boss Ever podcast series. I'm your host, Carl Thomas, and for my loyal listeners, we've got a tremendous lineup of guests planned for 2023. For those of you who are new to the podcast, the Best Boss Ever asks this simple question: who was the best boss you ever had and why? And then the magic happens. Each episode is a wide-ranging and fascinating conversation with some of the best leaders in business, sport, and entertainment. And this season, we'll sprinkle in those emerging leaders who are making big strides every day and certainly headed for the C-suite. Thanks for joining us today, and stay tuned because the hits just keep on coming. Our guest today, Lindsay Arell, is the founder and principal of Honeycomb Strategies, a woman-owned sustainability consulting firm, and she specializes in the events, venue, and hospitality industries. With over 20 years of experience, she's enjoyed working with some of the largest and most sustainable venues, conferences, events worldwide. A few of those include the Colorado Convention Center in Denver, Barclays Arena in Brooklyn, the Philadelphia Eagles and their home turf, Lincoln Financial Field, City Park Stadium, Moscone Center in San Francisco, and the Natural Products Expo West and East. The number of awards and honors and accolades that she's won over the past 10 years are way too numerous to mention. But let's just say she is one of the best in this industry, and we're so glad that she's been able to spend a few minutes with us today. Lindsay, welcome to the Best Boss Ever podcast.
Thank you so much, Carl. It's so fun to be here.
Well, listen, none of us get where we are by happenstance or without help. So we always ask our guests the exact same question, and that is, who was the best boss or maybe influencer that you've ever had and why?
Yeah, so I started in the events industry, I guess, longer than I care to admit. And my boss was Debbie Welsh at the Colorado Convention Center. She was the director of events. And, you know, I had been working in the ski industry before that. And so coming down and being an event manager with Debbie was like my first, quote, real job. And those that work in events know that it's nonstop, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. But what she really instilled in me, and really something that now that I have my own company with my own employees, is she really trusted us to get our work done, but she always was there to support us. So she always had our back. She was always there for any, advice that we might need or direction, but she wasn't a micromanager. And she wasn't my last boss. After I left that position, I went to a new role when I moved to Montana, and I experienced the total opposite. And that's when although I had appreciated Debbie, when I was working with her, man, I appreciated her so much more after I experienced the opposite of that. And I think it just makes, when you know that someone's trusting you and putting their faith in you, it's just, for me at least, it's so much more effective because I just want to, make that person, I want to make them proud. And I think it's really translated to being able to now have my own company where now my bosses basically are my clients, and they're coming to me and they're expecting me to do the work and be, the expert for them. And so I think I owe a lot to Debbie for sure.
Well, that's a great story because you used the magic word in my mind, and that's trust.
Mm-hmm.
When you feel trusted and when you trust your upline, in this case, Debbie, your energy, your enthusiasm, your confidence, your capabilities, your whole perspective on what you're doing, how, when, and why you're doing it changes all for the good, right?
Absolutely. And another thing she did is the events, and I've noticed this obviously working in the events industry, so that this is also unique. She really valued our life-work balance. So even though we were young event managers, you could work us as much as you wanted to, she really understood that we, in order to be happy and successful, we also needed to feel good outside of work. And so we would get together at the beginning of every month and put down our schedule, and that was it. But it wasn't, this event grind that can be a part of the industry for sure.
Oh, that's for sure. We've all lived the event grind world, good, bad, and ugly sometimes. You mentioned the other word, which I think has some magic in it as well, and that's balance. Life work, family personal time, all those things sort of blend together. And when there's a recognition and an understanding that recharging is necessary, that's a fact, and that there's an allowance, if you will, or a wider berth to sort of enjoy that balance, doesn't mean you work less. Doesn't mean you don't work hard. What it means is there's a balance, right?
Exactly. And it's interesting. I feel like since, COVID, the pandemic, where everything got turned upside down, the idea of like standard PTO days and, that has been, totally turned upside down. So again, in our company, we have like a number of days, but recognizing that our team travels and they need to recharge. It's not, if they can take off when they want, just because we know, we expect a lot and we want them to also feel good about what they're giving and their balance. So it's interesting how that's changed, I think, in, the workplace overall.
No doubt. And clearly, Debbie influenced fairly dramatically your leadership style, which sounds awesome. And I've met several of the folks that you work with, who work with and for you, and I haven't seen a speck of nobody not loving what they do, and they're proud of the work that they do with Honeycomb Strategies. So let's dive into Honeycomb a little bit. I mean, certainly in the last 20 years, more in the last sort of 7 to 10 years, the focus on sustainability, quote unquote, call it whatever you will, and there are lots of ways to define it, I think, but there's a clear requirement from, large scale institutions, events, and venues that we ticked off at the top, all the way down to the individual, right? How the individual chooses to operate on a daily basis. So let's start with your definition of sustainability.
Mm-hmm. So when talking about sustainability or thinking about sustainability, we definitely go beyond the environmental piece. Like we look at it, and I'm sure, you've heard of the triple bottom line, but really looking at obviously our environmental impact, but how are you also interacting with your community? And how are you also interacting with, your team and, your kind of key stakeholders there? So when we by having that holistic approach to sustainability, they really all work and weave in with each other, right? So when we're talking about a no idling program, which is one of the very first programs I did at the Colorado Convention Center, that was in reaction to poor air quality, that the convention center was located outside of a school. And there were a lot of, trucks and things moving and that would just idle, and how that affected the local community. So you can't separate environmental impacts from people. And, a lot of times that's also the motivation, right? We want to have these programs to preserve, nature and the resources that you need for human life, basically.
Right. No, that's super helpful. You jogged my memory a little bit. One of our former guests, awesome guy, 5th generation wine grower in California, Phil Wente. We talked about, because, they have acres and acres and acres under planting, and they're growing grapes and they're, making wine. And he said sustainability really had 3 parts: environment, for sure, community, and the impact of, a business or an industry on that community. And the third bit was, he said, listen, we have a lot of employees, and we owe those employees not just wages and salaries and time off and that sort of thing, but we owe them quality of life. And that quality of life comes through our ability to earn profits every single year. Because if we are not a profitable enterprise, we don't have an enterprise. And then we don't have jobs and we can't impact the community. And I mean, it was just this waterfall, which you just touched on, which I think is so awesome.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think businesses need to approach it that way too. And that's when you get buy-in on all the different levels, right?
Right. Right. It's a three-legged stool, which, as we all know, makes a perfect plane. There's no wobbling in a three-legged stool. It starts to wobble when you add the fourth leg. That's another story. So there are lots of ways to achieve progress. I know, because I've learned from you over the past, year. So can you describe a few of them and maybe the best ones, at least your best practices on how do we, the collective, achieve sustainability?
Oof, that's a big one. Well, so I think the approach that we take when working with a client or on a new project is the first step is really to listen and observe, right? So we don't come into a project or to a client with a list of these are the things you need to be doing and this is how you're going to do it, or these should be your priorities. Our first step is really to go in, meet with the client, visit the venue, and really understand how they're currently practicing and operating their building or their event. And most often, they're doing a handful of things really wonderfully. And they might not even be identifying them as a sustainable practice, if you will. It's just good practice, right? Which is, in our minds, the foundation of sustainability anyways, right? It's about efficiency and communication and all those things. So we really like to go in, listen to frontline, listen to the employees, listen to the people doing the work, the ones that see, the inefficiencies or see the opportunities. And then we really, from there, obviously we know the broad framework of, looking at waste, energy, water, janitorial practices, procurement. So we have that framework to look at. And then, where we see that maybe they have an opportunity to do something, then we talk with them and, figure out what their barriers were to not being able to achieve XYZ. And, every client is so different because we work, throughout the United States and even globally. And, the way that our society is set up is every location might have different challenges around waste, or water's a big issue, or they aren't located, local food procurement isn't an option because they just aren't located in California, or, what have you. And so we really don't like to go in with a total, set of prescriptives. We really like to go in and really collaborate and see what are the priorities too. Sometimes, like, for example, we have a client where single-use plastic is their number one thing. And so we are just constantly looking for ways to eliminate that from, their operation. So it's a listening exercise, and then it's collaboration. And then the other big piece is data, just collecting metrics.
You nailed a lot of things right there.
That was long-winded. Sorry.
No, it's perfect because you're client-facing, and no two clients are the same. They're all unique. They all have a unique perspective. It could be, being driven by a whole number of factors, right? And your job is to sort of listen and ultimately distill down not only what they believe are the sort of priorities, if you will, in the case of the one you just mentioned, it's single-use plastics, but the broader template that you have come to understand as perhaps a toolkit of best practices that after you've listened, you can bring to bear on an event or a venue. And do you have some of those best practices that you could tick off?
Yeah. So I'll use the example of SoFi Stadium and City Park. So SoFi is in Inglewood, California. City Park is a new MLS stadium in St. Louis, Missouri. So with both of those clients, we were lucky and fortunate enough to begin working with them before they opened their building. And so that is just like a really amazing opportunity to help them shape their policies and have the conversations with their vendors as they're contracting and kind of moving through that process. And so, in terms of best practice, would be really to, I don't know if this is considered a single best practice per se, but really working and communicating with your vendors, because they are the ones that are going to be kind of supporting and making sure to like vet your vendors ahead of time. And I know sometimes, you don't have that ability. You're, constrained by especially for municipalities who you have to use for waste, what have you. But really working with that vendor to clearly set your priorities with them and figure out how they can help you meet those goals. And then as much as possible, put that in writing and then request metrics back or reporting back, and really, maintaining and requiring a open dialogue. So not necessarily a best practice, but a approach, I guess, that we try to take with our clients. And again, not every client are we coming in when they're establishing those relationships. So sometimes we have to come in after, you've had, a vendor for 20 years and all of a sudden, a venue or event wants to make a change. And how do you kind of bring that old school guard or whatever it is into the new way of operating?
Right. So there's obviously accountability there. You get it in writing and then reporting follows, which is fundamental accountability. I'm wondering, as you described SoFi and City Park before they opened, were you able to impact architectural plans and design and alter decisions that were being made that, I guess, on the one hand, didn't compromise the integrity or the vision of the actual stadium, but on the other hand, did make a difference as it relates to sustainability?
Oh, I wish. It's interesting because we are lucky enough to work with some of the most beautiful, buildings in the industry, and they're designed beautifully, and more, they're designed with sustainable elements in place. And obviously, LEED certification is kind of looking at the building envelope, but really our specialty is coming in once that building is constructed, and then putting together operational plans for them to actually operate it in the way that it's meant to be, which is good because that allows us to work freely between, older buildings like Lincoln Financial Field, where we're coming in, and helping put in practices, to a building that's been around for, years, to the new buildings. But it's all about how they're operated. You can have the most sustainable building ever, but if they, with LED lighting and all of the things, but if you leave that lighting on 24 hours a day, it doesn't matter. So, we're not as involved as I would love, in our work. We haven't been as involved with some of the work that we're doing with ASM Global, though. We're really excited that we are at that. Their ASM is bringing us to the table to have these conversations when they really, really matter. And I think that's showing tremendous leadership from ASM to recognize that sustainability is not the add-on. It's part of the conversation from the very, very beginning. So we're really excited. There's a new project called Green City that ASM is working on. And we've been brought into that conversation from day one. And so that's where we're really excited to see this conversation going.
Well, since you brought it up, full disclosure here, I work at ASM Global. I'm the Senior Vice President in our Commercial Partnership Group. And you, Lindsay, and I have worked quite closely together over the past year and will continue to do so. And the project you mentioned in Virginia, the Green Cities project, at least at this point, could be viewed as potentially a gold standard in development going forward, right? I mean, it's a large plot.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a large plot. There's one existing building on the plot that I know a lot of planning it will go into to make that as efficiently operable as it can be. But then the broader template of what's going to end up being in that total footprint and project is super exciting. And the good news is you and Honeycomb are involved at the outset, which obviously we all love and would like to, use it as a blueprint going forward. So you mentioned turning on and off lights. That's analog, right? You flip the switch and the lights go on and or off. Let's talk technology a little bit. There have been so many advances in technology over the past, one day, let alone the last 20 years. I mean, you cannot keep up with it. But technology seems to me to be a huge opportunity and toolkit for you when you bring practices, opportunities, new technologies that can impact the operational perspectives of buildings and events. So talk to us a little bit about the role that technology plays from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you're right on. Technology's everywhere now. And I guess we see it both in how obviously it can be utilized to better manage the buildings through, building automation systems and that piece of it, and having sub-meters and all of that aspect of it. But what's really exciting to me that I think we're starting to focus on is technologies to engage. So not only looking to engage attendees for events or engage staff and employees and really making more people a part of the process than just maybe that building engineer or that housekeeper. But so to give a more concrete example, and this is an old one, but we finally have seen a shift, it seems like, from the paper program for an event to a mobile app. And it's just so I feel like we were a part of that from when the idea of getting rid of that paper program was just the most absurd and obscene thing you could suggest to someone, to now, recognizing that the mobile app is the way that most people interact with an event. That's where they have their schedule. That's where they, reach out to other attendees. That's where, learn about the speakers that they're, listening to. But it was, that took 10 years probably to get from, the standard practice was a paper program that was, maybe 60 pages thick to this mobile app. But that didn't happen on its own, right? It happened with recognition of environmental savings, the invent of smartphones, and so it's a progress. So that's one that now every event has a mobile app. But then there's others now we're working more with carbon tracking tools. So attendees on the sustainability piece and their actions coming to the show and how they, what their behaviors are when they're at the show, and then working to take them even when they leave and they go back to their home communities, can they continue some of these practices? So it's much more interactive, I think, because of technology now. And then, from a company standpoint, Honeycomb Strategies, we are using technology to gather data from a wide variety of KPIs, both from our venue clients, but also our event clients, that we're able to then track year over year, trends, make recommendations and strategies based on past data. But it takes time, right? So it's the technologies I talked about, building automation systems and sub-meters, those are the things that are really important from a venue to be able to capture energy consumption and waste and water consumption that then they can communicate to the event organizer, who then understands their impact. So it all works together. And I know it's a little overwhelming, but the technology is evolving and people are understanding the importance of that. And I think a lot of it, again, it's happening faster and faster, I would say.
Right. Well, listen, notwithstanding the outcry, I'm sure that came from the printing industry as printing programs, became extinct. But we're talking really cool stuff at the institutional level, right? Whether it's from the architect or we talked about Enrico County in Virginia and the coming out of the ground of the Green Cities Project. But every one of these buildings and every one of these events has individual patrons, fans, showgoers, conference attendees, and the list goes on and on. Otherwise, buildings and events wouldn't exist, right? You got to have people.
Right.
So how does what you do actually trickle down to the individual who walks into the Colorado Convention Center or walks into Lincoln Financial Field to see the Eagles play? How does what you do, I guess, how is it messaged, if at all, to the individual consumer? And if so, what is the message and how and what does an individual learn and can he or she take away from that event experience around your world?
Sure. Ooh, that's another big loaded question. So I'm going to, I guess, break it up into a couple different responses. So when working in the sports space is very, very exciting because it really is so unique at kind of bringing together such a diverse group of people from different, socio and economic backgrounds, and maybe they have different beliefs on a whole wide, scale of things, but they're there in one common goal, like for their team or for their city, what have you. And so being able to figure out a way to speak and engage that audience in a way that is exciting and meaningful is a really awesome opportunity. I think, so a group that does this really well is the Philadelphia Eagles. They have just really mastered communicating their Go Green program to their audience in a way where it's just a part of their overall team ethos. And they make it fun. And that's what I really, really love. So if you go, I don't know if you've been to Lincoln Financial Field, and I don't get to go in the men's restroom very often. So I don't know if it's still there, but I did get a tour and I love it. Above the urinals, their messaging was recycle your beer in here and your cups out there. Like, it's fun. It's eye-catching, and it's not taking it too seriously, right? And so they have that type of messaging throughout their venue. And then they take it serious where then they also incorporate it into, their communications with their season ticket holders. They, buy, when they send out their book at the beginning of the season, it has like seed packets and, they include touches of their program into every interaction that they're having with their fans. Even I remember a few years ago, more years than I want to say ago, when they eliminated plastic water bottles from any of like the hospitality. And so what they did was everyone got their Eagles water bottle, but inside it was messaging like, this is your water bottle for the season. And we have water fill stations located throughout and, use it. This is what you have now. So, I think that that's really powerful. And, they've really been able to be a leader in that space. I mentioned, the carbon tracking. So we're seeing more and more, we recognize that going to an event is probably the biggest carbon impact of any event. It's, can make up 80% of a carbon footprint of an event. But we're going to keep meeting. And obviously the pandemic taught us that we don't want to stop meeting in person. We need that. But, now there's apps that are coming out that allow attendees and fans to track their carbon for going to the show. And then they have opportunities to offset that so that, they're kind of taking that responsibility. But also, it's regional too, right? And location based. So the Colorado Convention Center, we worked with, local stakeholders like the National Renewable Energy Lab, the City and County of Denver, and some others to create a whole interactive display for convention center, attendees around sustainability and energy in Colorado. And so, there's ways to just, put in the know before you goes for a concert venue, all of those different things. You're always communicating, right, to your attendees and your fans. And so to just have that layer of sustainability incorporated is kind of how we try to suggest to our clients.
Right. The more it's messaged, the more it will resonate. Very few of us take the message the first time. And I want to say that there's an axiom in advertising that we might get the message by the seventh time we see it. That's assuming we see the same message 7 times in a row or whatever. The human system is a difficult one to turn, but clearly there's momentum around sustainability. It typically takes the form of environmental, but as we talked earlier on, it's a system in and of itself. And, I thank you for sharing some bits and pieces of how that system works. Your point a couple of times was, that's a big question, and there's a lot of legs to it. We totally get that, but there always has to be a starting point, and the starting point is the will of a venue or an event to listen to Honeycomb Strategies and then begin to understand not only things that are being done that work and good for us and you, but opportunities to change and or add things in that, will work over the longer term, and we all win in that regard. Listen, Lindsay, we've got a few minutes left, and I always finish with the same 3 questions. And our listeners actually love these. I get more comments on these questions, interestingly, than I get on the broader content that we include. So here you go. You ready?
Yep.
Okay, the first question is your favorite mistake. That's where you messed up in a really big way, learned from it, perhaps even salvaged the mistake, but took that learning with you, and it's still with you today.
All right. So when I was thinking about this, plenty of mistakes. It's so hard to nail just one. But honestly, I'm a firm believer that everything does happen for a reason. So I don't know. I always feel like kind of that hindsight is, I get why this happened and then we have this outcome. So, but one I was thinking about that was really kind of a catapult for my career goes back to a guy. So I had a job and I was living in Seattle and met him. He was in San Diego. And I decided that he wasn't going to move to Seattle, so I was going to move to San Diego. So quit my job, got rid of my apartment, and was about to make the move. And he broke up with me. So, and it was the first time I'd ever I'd never quit a job without another job, ahead of it. And so it forced me to really, I knew I didn't want to live in Seattle anymore. So it forced me to kind of try to figure out what my next steps were. So I drove back to Colorado and moved in with my parents and went back to the Colorado Convention Center where I had been an event manager previously. And I spoke with John Adams, who's the general manager there and is still just like an amazing, amazing mentor for me. And, suggested this idea. I knew I wanted to stay in events, but I saw like the opportunity around sustainability and the need for it. And so I suggested it to him. I said, John, I want to work back in events. I want to be in Colorado, but I need to do something about the waste and everything, this whole entire thing. And at the time, so this was 2007, the position of like sustainability for a venue didn't exist. And he kind of asked like, what will you do? And I was like, I don't know. And he was like, all right. And so he hired me, and I was the first sustainable programs manager for a convention center really that we knew of in the world. And now, you see that position all over, but it really was the beginning of obviously a career that I've had now for, almost 20 years.
Did you call the guy and thank him?
I haven't talked to him anymore.
Yeah, I'm sure you don't. Well, that's a good one, actually. So the next question is the favorite live concert and I know you've attended a lot of them because of what you've been doing for the last 20 years, that featured a female artist or a female-led band.
Yes. So this experience was just last year. So you're right. Red Rocks outside of Denver was a client of mine for many years. I've seen a lot of shows. I love live music. But last year, my mind was blown. We saw Susan Tedeschi and Derek Trucks at Red Rocks. I mean, just talk about one of the most powerful performers, male or female, just mind-blowing, and just her energy and passion. And I mean, it was a perfect night because it was at Red Rocks in the summer. It was just the most unforgettable. And I mean, by far, my favorite concert ever.
That's really cool. She is awesome. I have had the good pleasure to see her one time. It was back in the day. I guess a Snowmass Music Festival or music or something. Anyway, it was in Colorado. Yeah.
Okay.
And she is awesome. So that's a great pick. Last question, perhaps the most important one, and that is, we all know words matter, especially in leadership roles, right? It's what you say, it's what you don't say. We all know that. So the question is, your favorite word and why?
Hands down, transparency. So, and I think that's, in professional life, in personal life, I think it's because it really just embodies so many other things. When you're transparent, then people trust you, you're credible, you're accountable, that it allows for open dialogue. I think that's one of the biggest things we try to talk to clients about is, being transparent with where you're at and understanding that we're, not all going to be, the most, it's sustainability is a journey, and just, we're talking about that first step is sometimes it's just like coming to terms with yourself of where you're at and, where you need to be. And that's, being vocal about that. And they say that for any goal, right? You want to lose weight, you tell your friends that you're going on a diet because then they hold you accountable. So it's just that transparency. And I think, working with our team too, like I just really encourage anyone that is on my team that they just be straight with me, because it just saves so much more time. And it's just the way I like to communicate. And I want people to communicate that way with me.
I love that. And by the way, that word transparency or transparent, it's operational at every moment in one's life. Work, family, friends, by yourself on the hike from Crested Butte to Aspen. But just so everybody knows, you live in Crested Butte. You've done that hike a bunch of times. Lindsay, you have been awesome with your time today and fully transparent, and we so appreciate that. So thank you so much for being a guest on the Best Boss Ever podcast series.
I love it. Thanks, Carl. Thank you.
We really appreciate you taking the time to listen today. Thank you. Please subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. You can also find the Best Boss Ever on Spotify, Google, Pandora, Stitcher, and many other podcast platforms. Hey, how about some feedback? Email me at carl@thebestbossever.com. Or better yet, connect with me on LinkedIn at Carl A. Thomas. Lastly, I want to give a huge shout out to Peter Duff, my sound engineer. He just makes us sound better. Thanks again for listening, and remember, words matter.